Welcome to the Mongabay newscast. It's May 4th, 2022, and I'm your host, Mike Gorecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. No matter where on Earth you live, this is a time of year when birds are very busy, migrating, singing, breeding, and nesting. So on today's episode of the Mongabay newscast, we're talking about birds, why they deserve your care and attention, plus latest research findings and conservation measures. We're very pleased to welcome back to the program author Sy Montgomery, whose two most recent books are all about our avian comrades. The Hawk's Way, Encounters with Fierce Beauty, is out this week, and The Hummingbird's Gift, Wonder, Beauty, and Renewal On Wings came out last year. Montgomery tells us why these books speak to our current pandemic times, what she learned from her experiences with falconry and hummingbird rehabilitation, and why she finds birds so fascinating.
Seeing birds around us reminds us of how big and gorgeous and surprising our world is, and also how vulnerable. Because birds, the canary in the coal mine, the fate of birds, that's the fate of our Earth.
We also speak today with Mongabay staff writer Abhaya Joshi about the birdlife of Nepal, a new bird counting app that's sparking greater interest in Nepal's rich avian life, and some of the most recent conservation actions being taken in the country to protect birds. Sy Montgomery has written more than 24 books about animals and nature for adults and children, including Journey of the Pink Dolphins, The Good Good Pig, and The Soul of an Octopus, which was a finalist for the National Book Award in the U.S. We had her on this very podcast back in 2018 to tell us about her then new book, Tamed and Untamed, Close Encounters of the Animal Kind. In the show notes for that episode, we featured a photograph of Sy with a peregrine falcon named Banshee. As it turns out, we get to read more about Banshee in Sy's latest book, The Hawk's Way. Both The Hawk's Way and last year's The Hummingbird's Gift were originally chapters from her 2010 book, Birdology. They're both newly expanded and re-released in really beautiful hardcover editions by Atria Books. I asked Sy why the time was right for these two books in particular to be published.
Well, one thing was, with hindsight, you look back on experiences that you've had in the past, and you have new understandings about them. And in both of these cases, even though, except for the rather lengthy introduction for both of them, things have been updated, but they largely tell of a particular experience that I had. Looking back on the experience of helping Brenda Sherburne to raise those orphan baby hummingbirds, and looking back on my falconry lessons with Nancy Cowan, the master falconer to whom the book is dedicated, who alas died this year, I kind of see with new eyes how important these experiences were, and they have a lot to say to us now in the post-pandemic times.
Well, let's start with The Hawk's Way, which, as you've just mentioned, tells the story of your lessons with falconry instructor Nancy Cowan. What about that story speaks to our modern pandemic times?
Well, one of the things that just blew me away about learning about hawks and learning falconry was just how different a hawk is from anyone else I have ever known, including octopuses. Almost every other creature that I've ever known, I can usually get it to relax beneath my touch. The first octopus I met turned white beneath my touch after initially being red with excitement. I once was able to get a rhinoceros. It wasn't a wild rhinoceros, it was someone's rhinoceros, but I was able to get the animal to roll over because I knew how to touch it in a way that would please it. Oddly, with hawks, they do not want you to touch them. And what they want from you is something that I didn't even know I had in me. What they want is to hunt, and they want you to be a decent hunting partner. And post-pandemic, it really helped me to look back on this and understand the kind of love you have to have for someone whose outlook on life is as different from your own or my own as a hawk. And the introduction talks about how the Greeks said that there were 4 kinds of love, and we're familiar with them even if we don't use the same words that they did. There's eros, of course, that is romantic love. We call it romantic love. Philios, which is love for a colleague or a friend. Storge, which is the love you feel for a parent or an offspring. All of these kinds of love, as essential and celebrated as they are, they're all transactional, because you expect from your lover or spouse, for your desire to be quenched. You expect for them to love you back in the same way you love them. And same thing for, you expect from a parent that kind of love back. You expect a child to love you back. You expect a friend to reciprocate. But a hawk doesn't give you in return the kind of love you give to that bird. At least not the kind of love I gave to the bird. Just having the bird there on your fist so close, being bathed in its magnificence, just having it allow me to be his or her servant, that was enough for me. And the kind of love that I realized that is the kind the Greeks called agape. And it came to stand for the kind of love that we have for God and God has for us. It is not reciprocal. It does not expect anything in return. And I think we are, in this post-pandemic world, particularly hungry for that kind of love. After all this division that we have had, to be able to love and expect nothing in return, that is a hugely liberating love. And you wouldn't think that working with a magnificent hunter like a hawk would teach you new things about love. You would think this is, a predator, a descendant of the dinosaurs, a fierce creature. You wouldn't think it would teach you about love, but it does.
You write about how what attracted you to falconry in the first place was that you wanted to experience up close the wildness of these birds. You have a great line in there where you say birds are wild in a way that we don't experience in our relationships with our fellow mammals. Can you expand on that for us and tell us what it is about that wildness that you find so attractive?
Yeah, they seemed, the hawks that I've seen just exhibited this absolutely pure, innocent savagery, for a lack of a better word. These birds need and love to hunt and chase. They need to be hungry, but it's not just to satisfy their hunger. And that kind of ferocity, that kind of incandescent ferocity, is something that I found just immensely attractive. It was like having a flying dinosaur on your fist. Every other relationship that I have had with animals has been different from this. And it was so contagious, I think. Their desire to hunt, which in falconry is called yarrick, that heartbeat of wanting to hunt, wanting to chase, wanting to get the prey, not wanting the prey to suffer, not even having that on your mind, but just being so completely consumed and fulfilled by being able to do what you were created to do. And only that I think was like a purifying wildness. They gather so much through their eyes. They live through their eyes. Their eyes are twice the size of their brain. We experience so much of life not through our eyes, but through our brain. Even things that we gather through our eyes get so processed through our brain. What we think about it, the thing that you're actually seeing, can get lost in your thoughts about it. So you no longer see the thing anymore. Well, they see the thing. And they see in such detail and brilliance. They see in colors that we can't even name. They see in detail that we can't even imagine. And in this way, they are apprehending the world that we live in a way that our own senses just seem so pale and almost pathetic by comparison. And so just being with a bird like this, experiencing its life through its heightened, sharpened senses. I think this brings us closer to true wildness. It peels away so many of the layers that almost like sunglasses kind of darken and cloud our vision and understanding of the world.
There are a lot of truly amazing facts about these birds in your book. You mentioned their eyes already, and that was definitely one of the parts of the book that stuck with me the most. Their eyes are so large and so dense with receptors that they weigh more than their brains, and they have 2 focal points in each eyeball as opposed to 1 like us. And you write that owls' eyes are so large that if humans had eyes as proportionately large, we would have eyes the size of grapefruits.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's oranges, actually, but I mean, they're huge. And of course, that image makes you laugh because you see yourself with these giant eyes. You kind of look like a praying mantis when you try to give yourself orange eyes. But yeah, they really are seeing life more as it truly is, I think, in a way that we don't.
So what would you say you learned from your time with falconry and writing this book?
Well, I learned here is someone who wants something very different from what I want. But because I love them and so admire them, now I understand what they want. I'm a vegetarian, and if I see a squirrel that's been killed on the side of the road, it ruins my day, okay? But when I was hunting with someone I knew, when I was hunting with fire, or which was the name of one of the hawks, or smoke, when I was out there with this bird, desiring to capture their prey, to chase and capture their prey, all of a sudden, their wish was my wish. And that's very transformational. And that doesn't make me want to go out and catch a bunny or a partridge or something. But it made me so root for them to be successful in what they wanted. I could feel their desire burning hot in my heart. And that's a great thing. And also to feel your own, there was a lot of terrific technical stuff that I learned too from Nancy Cowan, my falconry instructor. Things that I would never, ever have suspected. For instance, I know a little bit about training animals, and I have a border collie who trained instantly, and I know about rewarding someone for doing what you want. You do not reward a hawk. If you give a hawk some food, this is her quote, you're giving them their food. It was their food to start with. You just happen to be handing it to them, but it's theirs. So you're not rewarding them in the usual sense. Even when you are training a hawk to do something, it's a whole different ball game. And it stretches your mind to figure out a mind like a hawk's. The first hawk that I flew was a big Harris hawk named Jazz. And I was actually Nancy Cowan's first student with my friend who I brought along, Celinda Chicoine, when she opened New Hampshire School of Falconry. And I did not realize until she told me years later that I was the first person other than Nancy that her young hawk would fly to. And that made me feel terrific. But you act totally differently around a hawk than you would around other creatures. I mean, of course, you want to go slowly. You don't want to do any quick movements, and you want to do that around all animals. They don't really like quick movements. But other than that, you had to refigure everything in terms of what that bird wants, because it wants something very different from what your dog wants or your cat wants, or even the octopuses that I knew wanted.
Well, that's very interesting because you're obviously someone who has developed relationships with a lot of different animals, and it seems like you have a totally unique relationship with these birds of prey.
Yes. I mean, you are the junior partner. That's Nancy Cowan's quote. You're the junior hunting partner. And if you're no good at being the junior partner, your hawk will fly away and you will never see it again. And so, many people think have different views about falconry. Some people feel like, oh, isn't it horrible to keep these animals in captivity? It's not in captivity, because the minute it comes out, if it doesn't like your company, it flies away. They only come back if they feel like it. So that's very different. Some people think like, oh, there's like a big mystical attachment to this bird. It's not mystical at all. You have to be worthy, a worthy hunting partner, which means, one, don't mess something up. If you mess something up, your bird may be furious at you and may even rupture the relationship forever. And it may not be that you did something mean. It may be that once Nancy was with one of her hawks named Indy, and they were hunting together, and Indy was on her wrist and was tethered to the wrist at that point on the glove. And she tripped over a root or something, and Nancy fell into the water. Well, Indy was incensed about it for days because Indy thought she had thrown him down and just got really mad. So when you're walking with a hawk who is tethered to you until you get to the part where you're going to let the hawk go, you've got to be super careful not to stumble, not to crash into something. Your hawk, too, just like any hawk in the wild, if you have to kill things with your feet and your face, that's really dangerous. And there's other hunters out there as well. So, there's always danger when you go hunting with your hawk. Your hawk could be injured or killed. So you're going into this extremely dangerous situation, but you're not forcing them to do it. This is what they're meant to do. All this is completely different from any relationship that I'd had with anyone ever before.
So, of course, we had you on this podcast back in 2018 to discuss your book, Tamed and Untamed. And I just realized that the photo we used of you at the time was of you with Banshee, a peregrine falcon that we get to meet in this book.
Yeah, poor Banshee. Banshee bites Nancy in the face within the first, 5 minutes of our lesson. And it was such a bloody scene. This peregrine was, at that point, a teenager. And Nancy, who bites you in the face? But blood was coursing down her chin and dripping onto the sidewalk. And I'm walking along with Jazz on my glove, and my friend had, I think, maybe Banner, the lanner falcon, or Emma, had Emma on her glove, who's a tamer bird. None of these birds are tame, but this is one that wasn't known to bite or bait off the glove or things like that. And I'm thinking, what have I gotten myself into? But when I looked into the faces of these hawks, I could not turn away, even with, this very bloody start to the whole thing. And Nancy behaved as if this was nothing. And their bites, the peregrines, most hawks you really have to worry about their talons, not their beaks. But peregrines frequently, after they capture the prey with their talons, they then issue a bite that breaks the spinal cord often to the back of the neck. And so they have a very sharp beak specifically to do that. And it kind of feels like you've been hit with a staple gun, she said. So it wasn't fun, but God, Nancy was brave. And she'd been attacked by her hawks for all kinds of minor infractions that they considered a problem in the relationship. And yet she was crazy in love with them, knowing fully who they were.
Let's talk about The Hummingbird's Gift now. How does that book speak to us in this pandemic age?
Well, I realized, of course, at the time when I was able to help Brenda Sherburne raise these orphaned baby hummingbirds, what a blessing that was. But it was a terrific story to share with readers during a time that it felt like the whole world was broken. And here was a story about putting the world back together. It was just two tiny little hummingbirds who really were little more than air wrapped in feathers. But being able to set that wrong right, being able to raise these tiny infants, having the power to restore them to the sky, and seeing how these fragile beings had such power and strength because and not despite of their fragility. That had enormous resonance as we were going through all this political division and the pandemic that seemed like it would never end. It reminded us that we all have powers to heal, and it reminded us that the state of being fragile it doesn't doom us, that the state of being fragile, at least for hummingbirds, is the source of their success and the reason that these little birds can do things that no other bird in the sky can do.
You, of course, worked with a wildlife rehabilitator, Brenda Sherburne, who has rehabbed several hummingbirds in the past. What was the experience like for you?
Oh man, when you first see them, they hatch out of eggs the size of navy beans, and they're only the size of bumblebees. And these little guys were like 10 days old. They still didn't have any real feathers. They had some pin feathers. They didn't look like hummingbirds. Their bills were still short and stubby, and they just looked like little bubbles of need. They're in this tiny, tiny nest, two of them fitting in a tiny nest, the diameter of a quarter. And nothing in the world seems so helpless and vulnerable. And to allow them to live, we had to do what seemed to me this horrible thing. We had a syringe, and we had to stick the syringe down their gaping throats. The syringe looked like it was the size of the Empire State Building. It was so scary putting that down the throat of the throats of these tiny little infants, and also knowing that hummingbirds, like most birds, are really they're made of air. They're mostly air sacs and lungs and a big heart. And so anything can pop an air sac. So, the idea that you could hurt them by trying to feed them. Well, not only can you pop an air sac, if you don't feed them enough, they will starve. But if you feed them too much, they can pop, literally, like a bubble. So this was a very delicate operation. And you want so much to save them, and yet, one mistake, and you can instead kill what you want to save. And so, good thing Brenda knew exactly what she was doing. She's very experienced in this. She knew exactly what to do. But even so, as we were raising them, we discovered that they got mites, which probably were in the nest to start with. But we had to kill the mites without killing the birds. So then, even after they started to grow and get their feathers and look like they were going to make it, then there was this other instance in which it looked like, oh my gosh, they could die from these mites exsanguinating them, or they could die from the poison we had to use to kill the mites. So it was a very dramatic story. And then the little birds had to learn to fly. And I don't know how to teach a hummingbird how to fly, but Brenda actually figured out a way to make this work. What she had was like a series of almost little hummingbird gymnasia. A little basket, and then like a bigger basket, and then like a semi-large cage, and then this big cage that she called the Hummingbird Hotel. And by giving them these gymnasia, they kind of taught themselves to not just fly, but do what hummingbirds alone of all the species of birds in the world can do, and that is hover. Sometimes we think we see a bird hovering that is not a hummingbird, but in reality, the specific way that you have to move your wings, which is in a figure 8, to hover is unique to hummingbirds, and no one else can do it. And they are so comfortable hovering that a mother hummingbird, when she wants to resettle on her eggs, instead of scooting around in her nest, she often hovers, twists, and then plops back down on her eggs. It's so second nature to them. And to us, it's a miracle. We just see a blur of wings. A hawk, however, because of their eyesight, can see each wing beat, but we just see a blur. And until the invention of the strobe, we had no idea what those hummingbird wings were doing. But they had to master that skill. And then when we let them go, they kept returning. The first bird, I was there for the release of the first bird. And at first, he was petrified because all the other birds were chasing him away. And he would come and ask us to come out and protect him just like he would his mother. And we could go outside and hold a little syringe, and he would hover in front of that syringe and drink from it out of our hands. But of course, what we wanted was for him to not need us anymore, and eventually to join the migration and fly to Mexico.
I imagine that was a very bittersweet experience to watch these birds you'd nursed back to health and then raised till they were capable of flying, only to watch them fly off.
Absolutely so. But that's, of course, what you want for them. You want them to own the sky. You want them to do what you cannot do. And hummingbirds they're super birds. And the reason they're so super has to do with their fragility. The peregrine falcon is the fastest bird if you clocked it, but if you tried to figure out what is the fastest bird in the world in terms of how many body lengths per second it can cover, it's actually a hummingbird. And if you're looking at how fast can you move in terms of body lengths per second, a hummingbird is actually faster than the space shuttle. And they're also enormous migrants. They're long distance migrants when you consider how tiny these guys are. And of course, the secret to being able to do all these things is that they are so tiny and that they've given up weight. They're so light. They're the lightest birds in the sky, and that's why they're the fastest birds in the sky. And to be able to let someone loose like that, someone with, this glittering beauty, to take on these Herculean tasks, someone who you met at their most vulnerable state, that is such a magnificent achievement to have even a tiny hand in that. And that makes you feel like, well, you too own a piece of the sky.
Well, you just touched on one of the fun facts about hummingbirds that I really took away from the book, which is that hummingbirds are actually faster than peregrine falcons, which are known as the fastest animals on the planet, as a function of their body length. You also write that hummingbirds have to visit 1,500 flowers a day and eat 600 to 700 insects to be as active as they are, and that a person who tried to do that would need 155,000 calories a day.
I know. I read one. I either read this or it was in a film. One writer asserted that if we ate that number of calories, we would burst into flames. But a lot of people do not realize that hummingbirds need those insects. That's a big surprise to many people. They think that they just drink nectar. But no, they need those bugs for protein. And while many people will put up their feeders eager to see a hummingbird, and they'll plant all kinds of beautiful flowers, trumpet-shaped red flowers in particular, and that'll attract plenty of hummingbirds. If you spray insecticide, you're completely undoing all the good you did for those little birds. So as appreciated as are your feeders and your flowers, I urge people, keep a compost pile where all kinds of delicious, yummy, bloody insects will hang out, because the hummingbirds will catch these on the wing, and it helps them to grow strong.
What would you say as to why people should care more about birds? What makes them so interesting to you and so deserving of our attention and care?
Well, for one, seeing birds around us reminds us of how big and gorgeous and surprising our world is, and also how vulnerable. Because birds, the canary in the coal mine, the fate of birds, that's the fate of our earth. Birds are the wild animals that everyone sees every day. It doesn't matter where you live. If you live in the middle of a city, you're seeing pigeons. You may be seeing peregrine falcons who have come back. If you live on a farm and you don't spray horrible chemicals that have killed them all, you see plenty of birds. And if you live near the woods, there's even more. They remind us of our wild world, and they remind us of our place on the planet. We evolved as hunter-gatherers who needed the natural world to survive. We were part of it. We are hardwired to pay attention to the natural world. If a hunter-gatherer does not do so, they quickly die because they don't know where the food is, and a smilodon comes and eats them. So birds remind us that we are at home here on the earth, that the earth is dazzling and beautiful and joyful, and that we owe every living thing our not just respect, but reverence.
Now we'll hear from Mongabay staff writer Abhaya Joshi, who is writing a series of articles about conservation of Nepal's bird life. Because most people probably just think of the Himalayas when they think of Nepal, I asked him to give us a bit of background on the incredible diversity of wildlife in the country.
So, for many people who haven't been to Nepal or haven't heard much of Nepal, the word Nepal would actually bring in images of Everest and other mountains of the Himalayas. But Nepal is more than that because we have like three different types of land in Nepal. For example, near the border with India, we have the flat land. It's called the Tarai, and historically it was a very forested area. And if you move north from there, you have the hills that are like the lesser Himalayas that are smaller than the mountains but higher than the plains. And then further north, there are the Himalayan mountains, which are the tallest mountains in the world. So the lowest point in Nepal is 60 meters above sea level, and the highest point is above like 8,850 odd meters. So there's a very like difference in altitude. So this diversity, it is very good for different types of plants as well as animals, and this range of altitude, it creates a lot of different climates suitable for different type of animals and vegetation.
What can you tell us about the bird life of Nepal? For instance, are there any particularly iconic birds?
Yeah, so there's one bird in Nepal that's called the spiny babbler, and it's said that it is the only endemic bird in Nepal. So it means that this bird is only found in Nepal and not any other part of the world. And then there are these migratory birds that come in from different locations, especially from the north of the equator when it's winter. And Nepal is has this climate that's suitable for these migratory birds as well. And so most of the other birds, like birds of prey, for example, vultures, raptors, and those kind of birds are also very abundant in Nepal. Around 875 to 890 species of birds are found in Nepal.
You've written a few articles in your series about Nepal's birds. One is about a new bird counting app that's sparking a lot of interest in the bird life there. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so but despite the all the diversity that we have in birds in Nepal, not a lot of people know about these birds because most of the birds have their own local names, and people don't know what people like these days. They don't know which bird is like name of every bird, and so it's become important for everyone to know their birds, know the birds that are there in their surroundings, in their community. But that has not been there because this knowledge that has to be passed from one generation to the other, there's some gap in that, and people don't know much about birds because nowadays we're living a life that's far away from nature, and we don't know things that our ancestors or forefathers did. So this app was launched by Bird Conservation Nepal. It's an NGO that's affiliated with BirdLife International that's been working on bird conservation for a long time. So they were inspired by this great backyard bird count that's been conducted in I think once every year. So I'm not if I'm not mistaken. So once every year there's a particular date on which this great backyard count is done worldwide, and they use an app to do it. So they wanted to use the same format to get to like engage the community, and for the community to identify the birds that they see around them. So that's what that app was about.
And has it sparked a lot of interest? Did it get a lot of use?
This is the first time that this app is being used, and it got a lot of attention in the media. And so I talked to the campaigners who were part of this campaign, and they were very excited that they got entries and responses from all over Nepal, and they're very excited, and they want to like do another round of count. This time, in the second week of May, they are partnering with their partners in India and Bhutan, and they are organizing a Himalayan bird count, so that the concept can be implemented in these countries as well. So looking forward to how it goes.
You've also written about Nepal's first bird sanctuary.
Yeah, so specifically, most of the protected areas in Nepal are designated for like big animals like the one-horned rhinoceros, the Royal Bengal tiger, or the black buck, or those kind of iconic animals that make headlines. Like, for example, every year we have this count of how many rhinos do we have, how many tigers do we have, and then doubling those populations and those things. But birds, they seldomly get those kind of that kind of attention because we take them for granted. So this bird conservation effort is mainly led by the local government in that area. So what happened is that there's no act of parliament or a legislation that says, okay, this is how you set up a bird sanctuary. But this local government, the mayor of that town, decided to do something about bird conservation in the area so that people would be engaged in that activity, and then other people and other cities, other towns would also follow suit, and eventually the federal government would bring in some kind of legal or legislation to implement this idea. So local governments in Nepal are very like they are in controversy because they have been known to spend a lot of money in building roads and infrastructure and not caring a lot about nature and wildlife and those things. But the mayor wanted to like do something different and send a message that local governments can also do their bit in conservation.
And what part of Nepal was this in exactly?
This is in western Nepal. So Nepal is like a rectangular brick. So it's between India and China. So we have like a very long length and a short breadth. So yeah, so we are a country that's stretched east to west. So yeah, so this is in far western Nepal.
In general, how urgent is the need for conservation across Nepal? What are some of the main threats to birds there?
So the other story that I did in the bird series was about birds found in farmlands in southern Nepal in the Tarai Plains near the border with India. So the study that I reported on it said that most of our attention has been focused on protected areas like national parks and forests, where we suppose that the birds live, and in wetland areas like the ones we mentioned before. The first sanctuary for birds is also wetland, marshy area. So this study showed that around a quarter of the birds that are found in Nepal are found in people's farms, and they are living there and coexisting with the people there. And but our attention so far has been focused only on protected areas and forests, and not in these farmlands where these birds have evolved to live with humans and to share the habitat. So that is one of the important issues because it involves around a quarter of the bird species found in the country. So, and the other issue is with infrastructure, the development of infrastructure. So there's one story that I did on a newly built airport in western Nepal. It's a very touristy town full of lakes, and so there's a new airport that's going to come up, but it's next to a landfill site where critically endangered vultures they come and feed. And so when the airport becomes operational, then we have the risk of bird collision with the aircraft, and it's not good for, it's neither good for the bird nor for the aircraft. So they're planning to shift the landfill slide away from the airport, but that hasn't been done so far. So the problem is that whenever you have a landfill site next to an airport, and the vultures are very like accustomed to feeding at the site for a long time. So when you relocate the landfill site, the vultures would still continue to come to the same area looking for food. So even if the site is cleared, the vultures will still come there, and it'll take time for them to realize that the food is no longer there. So infrastructure and the lack of attention that these birds get are major challenges that we're facing in bird conservation in Nepal.
So, in that study on farmland birds in Nepal that you wrote about, did it make suggestions for what conservation measures are needed?
Interestingly, they found that most of the birds they like sugarcane fields, and so one of the researchers told me that most of the farmland birds they have evolved living in tall grassland areas. So they were previously living in tall grassland areas, in protected areas, in national parks in Nepal, but those grasslands are no longer there. So the sugarcane fields represent, like, they mimic those kind of grass fields, and so they find it attractive. So and that's why they like the sugarcane fields. And the other recommendation was that in Nepal we don't have proper land classification. So for example, if you have a piece of land or a plot of land in Nepal, so you can build a house there and nobody would do anything about it, and there's no like classification of land for its use. For example, there's no rule that says that this land is for agriculture purposes only, and you can't build a house here. So if you own a land, you can build a house and you can do whatever you want on your private property. So that means that these farmlands that were in the southern plains of the Tarai in Nepal, so more and more houses are being built in these areas where traditional type of farming used to be practiced. So when these concrete houses are built, then the birds lose their habitat, and that's a major problem. And the other one is the building of transmission lines, power lines. They are also being built across the region, and so the recommendation was to build these infrastructure, these power lines, taking consideration of the activities and the behavior that these birds show. So yeah, these were the recommendations.
So, you're doing this series on Nepal's birds. What motivated you to write about birds like this, and what have you learned from doing the series?
Yeah, this is something new for me as well, because back in 2018, when I started writing for Mongabay as a contributor, my focus mainly was on the rhinos, because I was involved with the Asian Rhino series special reporting project with Mongabay. So I didn't have the option to report on other species. But now that I'm working as a full-time reporter for Mongabay, so I have more leeway in that sense. So when I started writing about birds, then I started reading up on what was going on, and then more ideas came up, and then one thing led to the other, and I decided, like, why not do a story, like a birds story series, where we look at different types of birds in different scenarios in Nepal. And the thing is that there's a lot of research that is going on into birds in the subcontinent, especially in Nepal and India, and lot of scholars who are doing their PhD and postdoctoral research have their work in bird conservation. So it's always easy. It's always like easy for journalists to write about things that have been like published in peer-reviewed journals and that have been discussed widely. So that has also made it easier for me to write about birds in general.
And what are some of your biggest takeaways from doing this series so far?
I started using this bird counting app, and it has names of the birds and pictures as well as the sounds that they make. So recently, I was outside at a park, and then I heard a bird noise, and then I played the sound on the app, and so the birds like they gathered and they came to a tree next to me, and so I thought that they recognized the sound and maybe it was a bird call. So it was interesting to see the birds respond to the sound that the app was making. And the other thing is that I didn't know that there are so many species of birds around my home. And so I could identify which birds are coming to my area and say that okay, these birds are there. So this is some kind of an achievement for me because I didn't know that because all the birds appeared the same to me. So until the app came along, and then I can use the app to differentiate between the birds that are around me.
If you enjoy the Mongabay newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. Another way to help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, and just $1 or more per month would really help offset production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, please head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay newscast. That's patreon.com/Mongabay. You and your friend can join the listeners who've downloaded the Mongabay newscast nearly 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/Mongabay or on Twitter and Instagram, where our handle is @Mongabay on both platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Mongabay newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gurecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.